Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science.
We're here today again with Dr. Mike Chamberlain. This is his second appearance on Wild Turkey Science. Glad to have you back, Mike.
It's good to be with you guys, Will.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I know we're cranking up in a busy time of the year for turkey enthusiasts like yourself, so I appreciate you taking some time to talk to us.
Not a problem. Always glad to participate.
Yeah, it's hard to find free time around this time of the year, I'm sure, with all the appearances and hunts and everything else like that you've got planned, but hopefully you've at least got a couple of those hunts planned in some cool places.
I do. We've known each other for a long time, and I do like to travel. I love to see different places and see turkeys in places that I don't get to see every day. So yeah, I'm going to be. I wouldn't say globe-trotting, but the month of April is going to be pretty busy. So,
is there anywhere new or different that you're particularly excited about this year?
Yeah, actually, I'm going to the Northeast this year, and I've spent very little time in the Northeast, period, in my entire life. And when I did, it was mostly in the winter for some work I did years ago. So my wife and I are actually going. She's going to go with me because the seasons up in the States we're going to. She doesn't hunt, but she's going to tag along because you can only hunt until noon. And so the afternoons we'll spend a little time as an old couple touring wineries and breweries and seeing a part of the planet that's pretty. We just have never experienced it.
Yeah,
that
really should be cool. Nice.
Yeah, should be cool.
Yeah, Will took Neva last year and she killed all the turkeys. So
That's
did
right.
You drink all the wine, Will?
Maybe not the wine, but there was some other stuff we drank that I may have been partially or mostly totally responsible for.
I gotcha. Well, Mike, I know that you get tons of questions this time of year in particular, and we have been too. And one thing that keeps coming up a lot for us is trying to walk people through the life of a turkey, and I think in particular the life of a gobbler.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things that we kind of wanted to start with you today is, kind of talk us through the life, I guess, of a gobbler, maybe from the time it hatches to what it's going through to, I think you said before the show started, to until it gets to the end of a barrel.
Yeah,
we're looking at it.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot to appreciate what they have to go through to get to that point. So,
yeah, I think as turkey hunters, it is important to understand, when you look down that gun barrel, what it took to produce the bird that you're about to take. So if you start out at the egg level, I mean, there's been very little research on this, but what work is out there suggests that, on average, most of these clutches are about half male, half female. So if you kind of think about, let's say you have 10 and about half of those would be expected to be male, although some of the work we have ongoing now suggests that at least in some years on some sites, it may actually be skewed female, which is interesting. But anyway, if you just kind of assume they're 50-50, you've got a handful of eggs that could possibly be, a male. And then, at least in the South, we're seeing that, I think we've talked about this before, about 80%, or give or take 75 to 80% of all nests are failing on a lot of sites. So if you just kind of take a population of hens and take 75% of those nests out of the equation and leave yourself with 25%, then, and half of, and let's say the average clutch size is 10 or so, which is about right. You start doing the math in your head, and you really don't have that many potential males to begin with, in all of those hatch clutches. And then what the work across the South pretty clearly shows is that, brood success, as we've talked about through time, is not good. We're losing about 2/3 of our broods the first month. So you start kind of doing the math, and slightly under 10% of all nests are producing poults that are surviving past that first month. And that may seem like an impossibly low number, but turkeys are supposed to be fairly long-lived as game birds go. So, she should be able to produce multiple clutches in her life, hopefully. And but if you just kind of look at the math right then, the the probability of even having young, 1-month-old males that could grow up to be a Jake and then grow up to be a Tom is quite a tall odd.
Yeah. So they're approximately 50-50, sex ratio at the egg stage. Do we really know anything about any kind of survivor bias towards one sex or another early on in life? I would imagine that we don't.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I was going to ask a similar thing at 1 month. Is yeah, what does that look like? Similar question.
yeah, we do know that male poults are a little hardier. They grow faster. They're a little, they're more aggressive. They're going to be bigger. And as if you look back at the classic literature on kind of poult development, you can start distinguishing males from females as they start, as they really start accelerating their growth. And many, many years ago, I remember George Hurst, who was a famous turkey researcher at Mississippi State. He would say that in bad years, meaning, years where the brooding conditions are really poor, think cool snaps with rain and, these things that we know complicate the hen's ability to get all those poults under her, that in a bad year, you would see a bias towards male poults surviving because they outcompete the females for space under the hen. And that makes sense to me because, as they're getting older, particularly once they're flighted, 2 weeks of age, and they're starting to roost off the ground with mom, those males are growing super well. Both sexes are growing super fast, but those males are developing their behaviors. They're already starting to play fight and do these things that young turkeys do. And I think George was spot on in that assessment. And as an aside, if you look at the past about 14 years of data that we've collected on broods, where we go in every few days to our GPS marked hens that have broods with them, and we observe them, or we set up camera arrays to try to get pictures of those marked birds so we can understand how many poults they have left after a month. The brood size is about 3.5 to 4. So meaning that about, let's say, 4 of them survive that first month. And it gets a little messy too because brood hens are starting to amalgamate with other brood hens after a few weeks, meaning that, they're going and joining other successful hens. And that's a strategy a lot of hens use, not all of them, but a lot of them do. But anyway, so you got about 4 of those poults that are surviving that first month within a brood on average. And what's interesting from there on is we don't, and you both know this, we don't know a lot about what happens then. Like we
You
spend a
mean
lot
from
of
1 month on?
yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that's just a failure on researchers' parts, and I'm not going to say failure, and I'm casting stones at myself here, but you guys have been graduate students and you understand how this works. You're
Mm-hmm.
getting to the end of the reproductive season on these field crews that are busting their tails collecting this data. It's July, you've been
They've already
working
been in the
hard.
field 6 months,
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And
7 months.
you track those broods for that first month of life, and then you kind of have to stop at some point. You have to slow down at some point. And broods get really tricky to monitor after a few weeks of life because they start roosting off the ground. They start spreading out from the hen in the trees. They'll start using different trees than the hen sometimes, and it just makes it's complicated to get to the brood and get the data that you want. So after a month, we back off on our monitoring, and then they start spending time around other broods, and it just gets messy. But from the time we stop the monitoring at day 28 or 30 until we start trapping in January, we don't know a lot about what happens then. There hasn't been a lot of research where older poults were captured in late summer and then monitored through the fall. In fact, there's been very little research like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mike, based on your data at 1 month, what you were saying about 4, do you have a good idea of what the sex ratio is at that point?
I can speculate based on what we're seeing in our trapping data in the winter. And what I
Okay.
mean by that is we catch a lot. Putting your hands on jakes is quite simple in most of our populations.
Mm-hmm.
Catching juvenile hens is not. And what I mean by that is a group of 10 hens walks up to a rocket net, and you know this, you just catch who you can catch. If you catch
Mm-hmm.
all 10 of them, you catch all 10 of them, but a lot of times maybe you catch 8 or 9 or whatever it is. But it's a somewhat of a random sample. I mean, within that flock, you're pretty much getting everybody, or you're getting most everybody. So yeah, there's a
Mm-hmm.
little bit of bias, but the bottom line is we're not catching many juvenile females, meaning females that were hatched, hens that were hatched
Mm-hmm.
that previous summer, and they're about 6 months old now. We don't catch many of them. On the order of about 12 to 15% of the hens that we catch at best are younger hens.
So when you were saying bias in the capture, do you mean like the adults and the jakes are in on the bait and they're keeping a Jenny away from the bait, and maybe you catch
No,
less of them
I'm
because of that?
saying that we don't have any reason to believe that that's actually happening,
Yeah.
because when we catch the groups of hens, we're
Yeah.
catching pretty much everybody that's in the flock. So
That
you would
yeah,
have.
that's what I wanted you to clarify, is that you're saying that you don't think that is a problem.
I don't. No,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah, he's saying
And
the capture effort is non-selective, but what they end up catching is skewed towards the jakes.
Yes.
adults, yeah,
Yeah.
Right.
or in the hen flocks, they're mostly all adults, meaning
Okay.
there aren't juvenile hens in most of these winter
Mm.
flocks, which is a problem. But yet, finding groups of jakes to catch is not that
Right.
difficult. So our trapping data suggests that there is some type of
Mm-hmm.
sex bias in juvenile survival, but we don't have the real detailed data from end of month one until we trap in the winter.
Yeah. So Marcus and I have heard you talk about this several times before. And so, it's stimulated a lot of conversation between us as to, what is it that's happening? And it kind of makes me wonder, is greater male survival at that life stage a feature or a bug, right? So I could
Hmm.
see, from like a fitness perspective, you want to produce, fit males that have a high probability of breeding with multiple females throughout their life and producing clutches so that your genetics are
Hmm.
really well represented in the next generation. But then it also seems like, it would be better in terms of just population growth to produce more females than males.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I don't know, like, is this just something that turkeys, have evolved to have, and it's just been good enough to get them by? Or I don't know. I mean, I guess, it's tough to answer this without speculating.
Yeah, and I think it is just speculation. Again, I go back to those conversations that George Hurst used to have with us. That when times are good and conditions are what they should be for broods, most poults should survive a brood. That they
Mm-hmm.
your brood sizes should be much larger than what we're seeing now. Um, I'm like you from an ecological standpoint. It would seem to me that turkeys would be wired to have female biased
Mm-hmm.
sex ratios at conception, let's say, at hatching, but but I mean, I don't have the data to support that.
Mm-hmm.
That's just to my mind, that's kind of, we know that adult female survival and nest success are primary drivers of productivity in turkey population. So it seems plausible to me that if it was going to be biased towards one sex, it would be biased slightly towards females.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
But the only other work that's been done, which was work that was done in Texas, found a slight bias towards males. And I wonder whether it's just, as you collect data across year after year after year and site after site after site, if you just wouldn't end up seeing that it just fluctuates one direction around 50% or the other through
Right.
time.
Mm-hmm. And
Yeah.
I even wonder if most years are bad. Do you have a male bias because most years are bad, and it's not that biased when things are good, like you
Hmm.
were saying earlier?
Yeah, and I just wonder too. I wonder if, from a general fitness perspective, whether hens, as the past few decades have progressed, if hens are just going into the reproductive season in poor condition,
Mm,
they're just not as fit, and maybe what we're seeing is just, you know there's male biases because, like you said, that we don't have ideal brood cover in many areas like we have
mm,
historically. We've lost early successional habitats that are providing succulent plants and abundant insects, and therefore our poults are hitting the ground, and their job, if you will, is more difficult.
mm,
And what that's causing is this systemic reduction in the ability for young jennies to make it, to
mm,
get into that fall population. And if so, maybe it just links directly back to, we just don't have the early successional habitats that we
mm.
need for this bird, and as y'all have talked about with many other species that use those same
Yeah.
communities.
Well, that kind of links to another thought that I had is, and maybe you are aware of information that I can't come up with at the moment. Do we do we have good historical accounts from when they were, other researchers, or even maybe during translocations? What was the composition of the flocks when they were trapping them? Are there any records on that?
That there are, and I don't. NWTF maintained all those records, and I know they exist. I have not obviously seen all of that to know.
Hmm. I just
Um,
wonder, is this like sort of like what Will was talking about? Is this a feature? Should we expect that, or is this something that's changed?
well, if you look back at so for instance, the work that Van Gelder and Kurzieski did in
Mm,
the 1980s in Missouri, there were about 3 juvenile hens per adult hen in their study. That's what their productivity was,
yeah,
and we're now down to about 0.15,
per adult.
young hen per adult. If you
Yeah, I
look at the
remembered
work
that
from
now.
Yeah, if you look at the work from Tallahassee that was done in central Mississippi from about That work started in late 1987 and concluded in 97, and at least and all signs pointed to that population declining as that work was ongoing. Early on in that study, there were a lot more juveniles in that population per se than what we're seeing now, but less than what you saw in the Missouri work.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
So it's
So
higher than 0.15, but lower than 3 to, or would you say 1 per
it was
3?
about three. It was about
Or,
3 juveniles per adult in the
yeah,
Missouri
okay.
work. Extremely productive populations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing that's curious to me is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, but I mean, I just get the overall impression from reading like Illumination in the Flatwoods that even post hatch, that the the Jakes are really kind of running the show, and like they seem to almost be, dominating the hens for food resources and maybe even leading the brood around early on in life. Is that an accurate assessment, or?
Yeah, and from talking with Bill Healy, who as y'all know, was a researcher, did a lot of work in West Virginia. He did scientific research. Joe Hutto's work was more,
Right.
kind of observational work. Um, Bill, on the other hand, did the same type of imprinting, but he was
Mm-hmm.
using those poults for other purposes. He was trying to study sociality and behaviors and look at nesting of these captive hens. And I spent a couple of days talking with him about various things, and this topic did come up. And he and his wife, who helped imprint a lot of these birds as well, said the same thing. They echoed that as these broods aged, the jakes were certainly more aggressive. They, I don't, for a bad pun, they kind of pecked at the hens. A lot of head pecking, a lot of fights, and although at that age, they're constantly doing that anyway. Bill did note that if they ever could injure a female, he'd have to remove her from the brood,
Mm-hmm.
because they couldn't tolerate the bullying and constant harassment that would come from the jakes.
Mm.
And that makes sense. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, and you follow jakes as they age. If you're lucky enough, which was as we're talking about, you're not always lucky enough to see juvenile birds in the fall, but if
Mm-hmm.
you do, it's a constant ruckus. They're constantly, disrupting each other. And then you look at jakes as they transition into that first spring, and they're, Tess Jolly calls them bullies, and that's really what they
Mm-hmm.
are. If they can get in large enough groups, they're a handful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's interesting. So now I guess we've kind of gotten to the Jakehood. So maybe we could continue on with, how are things changing, I guess, for their life.
Yeah, so I mean, like we said, there's a lot we don't know about that first fall in their life. I'd love to do, we tried this, just backing up a second. We tried this back years ago. I was involved in some work as a graduate student where we put necklace transmitters that kind of hung around the base of the bird's neck, and the transmitter wire kind of laid where the beard would be.
Mm-hmm.
Think about it like that, maybe a little bit above the beard. And I forgot how many we caught. I want to say it was less than 10. So take
Mm-hmm.
this for what it's worth. But most of those birds actually made it. I think we lost one juvenile hen later in the fall to a predator, but and I think it was about 50-50 jennies to jakes. Most of them made it until those units only lasted about like 6 months. The
Mm-hmm.
batteries. And but
What
other
age
than
were they
that,
when you put that on them?
they were about those birds were caught in September.
Oh, okay.
So they were 4 months old ish.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but since then, there really hasn't been a lot of work in this, and I would personally love to do this type of work. Again, it's just where do you put your priority, where do you put your
Mm-hmm.
priorities, and
Mm-hmm.
But with technology now and the proximity sensors and all of the technology we have, it would not be extremely difficult to get at this question, to catch birds later in the summer. The issue, as you both know, when you get into summer in the deep south, captureopathy catching birds becomes really problematic, and you have
Yeah.
to be really careful, and particularly with younger birds. So that's a challenge. But anyway, um, once those birds get to the fall, all signs point to it's smooth sailing for them until they get to the spring, meaning their survival appears to be quite high. Those jakes are spending time in the fall in winter flocks composed of other jakes that are either their brothers or not. And they're spending time in and around winter flocks of hens. And we all see this. You see a group of hens, and there's 5 jakes shadowing them,
Mm-hmm.
kind of hanging around the sides. And in fact, if you look at our trapping data, we routinely catch 1 or 2 jakes with our bigger hen flocks.
Mm-hmm.
And it's usually byproduct. And what I mean, the hen flock gets to the bait at the net, and one of the jakes sneaks in, to get a
Yeah.
bite, and
Mm-hmm.
we happen to catch him. So the reason they're doing that is, we think, and it's logical to me, you may disagree, but I think those jakes are associating with those hens because, one, none of us want to leave home. um, but two, there's security and there's experience in those hen flocks.
Oh
Those
yeah.
those hen flocks that have those adults in it, they know where they're going, they know how to survive the winter, they know where resources are distributed, and there's stability in winter flocks. There's
Mm-hmm.
nothing's changing at that point. So
Right.
it kind of makes sense to me that, hang around in the same flock your mom's in or other moms are in, and learn how to navigate the landscape and where these winter resources are. And that's kind of what we see. And then, we're having this conversation in March. When you're trapping turkeys in the winter, you start seeing this clear change where these jakes are starting, at least here where I live, mid-February ish. You're starting to see these jakes end up moving away from the hens. They may disappear for a day, 2 days, 3 days. Then next thing, you see those groups of jakes hanging around those hen flocks again, and then they're gone again. And what they're doing is their strife increasing. The hens are starting to split up into their breeding groups and move to areas where they're going to interact with toms. The jakes are now in a situation where they flock together because, one, there's safety in numbers, but two, they're having to navigate the landscape differently than breeding toms and hens. So you start seeing this pretty clear segregation where the jakes are on their own in a small group. And sometimes if you've got, groups of toms that are together, they'll keep jakes at bay, and the jakes will be off on their own. Or other times you may have, single toms or small groups of toms, and you get these big groups of jakes, and now they're starting
Be
to try to
bullies.
harass and be bullies. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, there's no bird that's as much of an outcast as a jake in the spring, it seems like.
yeah.
And the
Yeah.
reason that they tag along with those hen flocks is because the gobbler flocks won't allow them to join, right?
That's right.
Earlier in the fall. I mean, I've heard maybe there's some situations where, if the gobblers are depleted enough in an area, maybe they'll join up with the jakes, but that would probably be the exception, not the norm.
That's right. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, they're not allowed in the old men's club, if you will.
Yeah.
So they're off on their own. Interestingly, you just brought that up. That's a good point. I have seen situations where you had groups of jakes that had a single tom with them. And I don't know the reason behind that, but I killed a bird in Florida like this one time, that just a few years ago, that he was with a group of jakes, and the person that was kind of the caretaker on this property felt very strongly, because he had been watching these birds, that this Tom was socially the least dominant adult in that area, and these other three Toms that were in that same general spot, he had seen them gang up on this bird and just pummel him twice. And so I think this guy just took the approach of, I'll just go hang out with the kids, and stay away from these older bullies. But yes, to your point, is the adult Toms, if they're in groups, they're not going to socially tolerate these jakes being around.
Right.
I was in Mississippi maybe, I don't know, 6 years ago or 7 years ago, and we had the same thing happen where I was calling and the other guy I was hunting with was shooting, and we had messed around with these birds all morning. We had a lot of gobbling going on. We were trying to get them to come up the hill to us, and it was probably like 9:30 in the morning. Finally, a few of them broke off and came up, and there were 4 or 5 jakes and one longbeard.
Mm-hmm.
And they walked in. They kind of just parted, like the Red Sea or something. They just parted, and the gobbler was standing in the middle, and he shot him.
Mm-hmm.
But I just thought that was so odd, that he came up there like that.
That's basically what my bird did. He was following a group. If you look on the video, he was the last bird in the sequence, and all these jakes come funneling past us, and literally, just like you just said, just kind of part, and there comes this guy, and now I think there were 8 of them, if memory serves me, other than him, and that was a lot of heads to navigate to let everybody get settled
Yeah.
down. But
I was really nervous when it was happening
yeah,
on
I
my
was
end,
I
because I was
was too.
looking behind, and I was like, I don't know if he knows they're jakes.
Yeah, and if
But
you
one
look at the
clearly
video,
wasn't.
actually, it looks a little sketched, but because the video was, he was not behind me. But if you look at the video, you're like, wow, why did you take that shot, Mike? But it was clear. He was clear of any bird. But yeah.
We'll cut that video in on YouTube.
Yeah, I didn't expect to need my tissues today, but y'all are telling these stories about these gobblers that are lost and just been relegated to hanging out with jakes coming in by the. I mean,
Will's thinking I'd have just shot the jake.
And and in both of these stories, it didn't end well for that Tom either.
That's right.
No,
I mean, maybe you put him out of his misery. I'm not sure.
He's been getting whipped. I'm thinking back to that gobbler. It was a fairly normal gobbler otherwise, like the body weight and beard length and spur length and everything. Nothing stuck out as being puny.
I mean, maybe you should have measured his snood.
I failed to do that. I will know better next time.
Now you know. You'll bring your spring scale with you.
Yeah. Snood measurements.
So one of the things kind of that popped into my mind while we were talking about this is, do we see a consistent dispersal at some point in the fall or winter that is kind of like an anti-inbreeding mechanism? And is that biased more towards males or females?
So we are looking at genetic composition of winter flocks so these would be flocks that we catch, say, in January, February. And what we're seeing is that in most situations, and I'll throw this caveat, the rare situations being, we are studying one population that is existing in very fragmented habitat. So you can imagine like a group of birds over here, and then 5 miles of nothing, no turkey habitat, nothing, and then suddenly there's another group of birds. In that population, the flock members within these winter flocks, particularly toms, are closely related. But in all of our other populations, we see a lot of mixing, and it starts with the brood flocks. So back there in the summer, like we were talking about, when when hen A hatches her clutch and she goes and mixes, starts hanging around with hen B that also hatched a clutch, and then hen C comes in with another clutch, and you see this, hopefully, if your area is producing turkeys, you see 3 hens and 20 poults, in July. And then those birds hang around and spend time, and then those 3 hens join with another 4 or 5 hens that are adults, and now you've got this winter flock of hens that's got 4 or 5 moms in it, some surviving female poults, and those jakes are from multiple. Those jakes that are hanging around, they're from multiple moms. Well, then when they go in and form these winter flocks, there's more mixing going on. So you may see um, some jakes that move from this part of the landscape. They may shift their home range slightly, and now they're suddenly interacting with jakes they didn't know before. And so you get a lot of mixing throughout these flocks being formed in the winter.
Mm-hmm.
So that translates to kind of these spring breeding groups where we've seen that most of these hens are not related to each other. So in other words, when the hen splits out of the winter flock to form the groups of hens you're seeing right now, let's say 5 hens that are hanging around together and they've got 2 toms that are with them, those 5 hens are very, very unlikely related. In fact, most of them have no relation whatsoever.
Even
So,
like for jennies in that group, I mean, presumably they're in the group with their mother, or am
that's
I
right.
missing?
Very, very low probability of being related, regardless of.
So even the jennies in the group of 5 wouldn't be
Mhm.
related to any of the hens.
More likely not related than, yes.
Oh,
And
wow.
what we've seen is if they are related, they're distantly related, meaning they were produced by the same tom, or
Mm,
or half sisters, or something, not siblings. They're not hanging around with siblings, and they're not hanging around in breeding groups with mom.
Hmm.
Yep.
wow, I wouldn't have expected that.
No, I wouldn't have either.
And it kind of flies in the face of, the work back, and I know we were talking about jakes, but we kind of got off track, but this does relate to the groups of adult toms that we're seeing. What we're finding, which is a bit contrary to what the earlier work had shown, the earlier work that Watts and Stokes did out in Welder, on Rio, showed that a lot of these males, these toms that were hanging around together, they were brothers or half brothers.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the work that was done out farther west on Rios, looking at the genetics of the mating system, showed that there were some siblings hanging around in those breeding groups.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're seeing with easterns is not that simple. It seems to be much more convoluted, where we see one group of toms. I'm just pulling numbers here. Let's say there are 3 of them. 2 of them are brothers and 1 is not. And then the next group of toms, just directly over the next hillside, none of them are related to each other. And then the next group of toms, it's some different scenario. And so it seems to be, yes, some of these toms and some of these jakes that are hanging around together are brothers, but some of them are not. Some of them are not related to each other at all. Like literally zero
Mm-hmm.
relatedness. So
How
that's
much?
interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. How much of that do you think is this mixing behaviorally versus? It sounds like you may have some data to draw some inference from it. Or, I mean, is some of that being driven by multiple paternity or even multiple maternity in a
Hmm.
nest, or is that all being driven by mixing? Sometime later in the year before they get to their winter flock or during the winter flock.
I think a lot of it is that mixing, which does make sense from an evolutionary standpoint to me, that there should be you should mix genetically within these winter flocks, because those winter flocks are going to split up into these breeding groups. And clearly this bird associates, in my eyes, based on the data we've just published, they do see a cost to breeding in the same group with a relative. There's some cost there, like we think about it as a cost, but there has to be something there from an ecological standpoint that it causes them not to want to be in a breeding group, with a sister. The other part of your question, we're literally, I'm waiting with bated breath on our genetics data. We should get more of this. We have some in hand, but we're genetically testing the eggshell membranes from all the hatch clutches, and we're getting really good data on sex ratios. But we're also getting data on relatedness within these clutches, and I don't have the data to share because Erin's literally crunching the numbers right now, and I'm really pushing her hard to try to, because I'm super interested in it. But as you know, if the work that was done that Alan Krakauer did, that work suggested that multi-paternity was quite prevalent, meaning
like a third of the nest, right?
I think it was about almost 40% of the nest
I
had at
remember high
least,
30s. Yeah.
yeah, something like 38 or something like that. But a relevant percentage of the nest had at least two toms represented in the clutch, and there was a much smaller percentage that had multiple females in the clutch, because they do parasitize each other, as which may not be well known, but turkeys are nest parasites, and we've documented this and published this as well, that, as have others, that they will lay an egg or multiple eggs in the clutch of another female. And what we have shown, which I think is really interesting and it's kind of intuitive, is that this seems to be really prevalent with hens that are in these breeding groups, that are hanging around with each other once they start laying. So they've got some idea of where this other hen is spending time, and that makes sense. They're not just randomly walking around and oh, there's a nest, I'll lay an egg in it. My suspicion is it's more complex than that. That maybe they're hanging around with a buddy during the laying period. They get some intel that she's going over there and spending some time, late morning, early afternoon. Maybe I'll spend some time following her, and I'll go put an egg in her basket, because then if she hatches one of my eggs, that improves my fitness. And Bill Healy actually, he commented to me at length about when he was imprinting hens and toms, but his captive hens, once they started laying, they did not want him, because they viewed him as a turkey. They did not want him or any other bird to see them go to the nest site to lay an egg. In fact, he said if they could see him or another bird, they were really erratic. They paced around and squatted and vocalized, and did not want to go to that nest site, which at the time he and I were discussing it, we briefly threw out that, yeah, maybe they're avoiding parasitism, maybe not, but I suspect there is something to that they just don't want to be seen.
Boy, wouldn't it be fascinating to try to collect some covariate data on the hens that do that, and try to, see if you could hone in on what increases the probability of a hen trying to parasitize another hen's nest. Is it something about her body condition, or the lack of suitable sites that she perceives on the landscape, or something like that may be driving those decisions?
Yeah, I was thinking about it from a density dependent standpoint, which could be based on how many birds there are, or how many birds per nesting opportunity there is, or something like that.
Yeah, and you guys know this. A lot of we track these birds and we collect spatial data, and they're, from a behavioral standpoint, many of those data points are fairly coarse.
Yeah.
How far she moves in a day, or how far she moves in an hour, or her speed, or you know, does she interact with another bird? And we don't know. We don't mark every bird, so we have uncertainty there because there's some hens and jakes and toms we don't catch. So there's we're working in this constant bit of uncertainty. But I've wondered the same thing. There has to be something that wires these hens to do that behavior. There has to be something that predisposes them to taking that strategy, because if you look in other birds, nest parasitism is common in colonial nesters, where you got this big group of hens, that are all together. Well, that makes sense. There's a nest right there, right beside me. I'll go put an egg over there. But turkeys don't, they're not colonial nesters. And there's also a lot of research showing that parasitism increases when you get high predation rates. And so maybe turkeys have always had to deal with high predation rates. So maybe they're just wired. Some hens are just wired to do this because it makes sense.
Well, that was
it's
the
just like
other thing I was going to bring
variation.
up. Yeah, I mean, we see variation in breeding strategies, like in whitetail bucks, for example, where you've got some that tend to cover a lot of ground and visit multiple doe groups, and then others that tend to be homebodies. So, I mean, it makes sense that we see that all over the time, all the time in nature, where there's certain individuals that have certain strategies, and it may not be related to the condition they're in, but just a function of who they are.
Yeah, and we're seeing the same thing. We've seen this with hens, that some hens are wired to survive on their own, and some hens are wired to reproduce, and they appear to have very defined strategies on how to behave during incubation. Some of them prioritize living, and they spend less time on the nest, and they behave differently than this other subset that really are quote unquote good moms. They're the ones, they are wired to sit at the nest. They don't take incubation recesses often. They don't stay gone long when they do, etc. And we see the same trend in toms. In fact, I just posted about this today, actually, that we're seeing this interesting pattern emerge where certain toms have certain strategies, just like you just said, Will. That and you see it in other species, so it's not surprising that it kind of fleshes itself out, that the individuals within these populations just have different strategies to go about their activities. And in this bird, like in most species, reproducing and not dying, that's the name of the game,
Right.
So I guess continuing on with the progression, the survival you were talking about with jakes is fairly high.
It
So
is. It is.
Can you talk about that? I know you guys have recently published some work looking at age-specific survival in the context of hunting, but I was just curious, what does it look like in Jake, and then how does that change as the gobbler ages?
Yeah. So, and I know you guys had Patrick Whiteman on recently, and he may have talked about exactly what I'm about to say, but at least on our southeastern study sites, we see very, very low harvest rates of jakes. I think it was about 2% or something along that line. Very low probability of mortality during the spring. So jakes are making it for the most part during, through the spring season, and they're transitioning into adults at the, once they reach that, what's technically their first, they were hatched in a summer. Now they've survived until the following summer. That's when you start seeing them very quickly transition from looking like a jake to looking like an adult. They go through as soon as the spring is starting to wrap up, you start seeing molting progress in earnest. Their beards are starting to get longer. You start seeing, let's say June, you start seeing these groups that have 3 or 4 birds and they have about 6-inch beards. They're starting to molt to where they look just like an adult because they're about to be. And then as you start getting, into that summer, they're in these groups still together, these smaller, these smaller social groups, but they're transitioning into adulthood.
Mm-hmm.
And all data that we have suggests that their survival during that period is very high. And then they get into they make it to their second fall, and now they're toms, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're starting to associate with other birds that are transitioning into adulthood. They go through the final stages of their molting sequence where now their fans are entire, their primaries are barred all the way to the end. The 9th and 10th primaries are fully barred. Their contour feathers, everything is an adult. And those are what are about to become our beloved 2-year-olds, that make us all look like we really know what we're doing when it comes to hunting, and those are going to be that's going to be the groups of 2-year-olds that we see. That's their second spring season. They are typically going to be around other 2-year-olds, but they're going to integrate into winter flocks with older toms that will tolerate them. So you do start to see some mixing of ages at that point. It's not uncommon to catch a group of, say, 8 toms in January, and you've got a couple of 2-year-olds and then some older dudes that are hanging around together. That's when you see a lot of fighting. You see a lot of strife in those flocks because you have mixed ages now, and you've got older dominant birds that are now interacting with these new coming 2-year-olds, and you see a lot of testing of the dominance hierarchies. This is when people like Tess that are so blessed to be able to be talented enough to do what she does, where they see and they document these knockdown drag out fights where
Mm-hmm.
that's what's going on at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And then it gets ugly, if you're a 2-year-old, because what our data clearly show is that about half of those jakes, like Patrick was talking about, we see a really high harvest rate of 2-year-olds. Once those jakes transition into 2-year-olds, based on our banding data, about half of them are being harvested winter 2. And then the probability that they're being harvested when they're 3, 4, or 5 is, as you can imagine, progressively lower and lower and lower,
Mm-hmm.
partially because behaviorally they become much more difficult to kill. And then you've also removed a fairly large segment, of those 2-year-olds at
Yeah.
that point.
And I would guess that part of the reason that they're behaviorally more susceptible to harvest is because those 3-year-old plus birds probably are successful in securing a lot more breeding opportunities, whereas the 2-year-olds kind of have to get it wherever they can find it. So if they have even as bad as Marcus's calling is, if he's over there squawking on a diaphragm, they're going to go to him because they don't have another opportunity elsewhere. Does that make
That's right.
sense?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that's you'll often see, once these winter flocks split up into breeding groups of toms, you would naturally expect, when the rubber meets the road, to see these smaller groups of toms be a couple of 2-year-olds that are together versus, the next group is a couple of old dudes that have been hanging around together for years, and they don't want to tolerate those younger toms with them.
Mhm.
So if you're one of those 2-year-olds, to your point, Will, and you see a breeding opportunity, you take it, because research is not just on turkeys, but many species has obviously shown that from a male's perspective, the number of females you can breed with is your primary determinant of lifetime fitness. right? So these guys are wired, like many, to breed with as many females as they can, and every opportunity matters when you're a bird that may only live 4 or 5 years. You know,
That makes sense.
it makes us feel so good. You know, when you when you see a couple that you think are probably 2-year-olds because they're literally running to you, and you feel like you're giddy, and you feel so triumphant and like you're accomplished. You know, like I just did something really cool. Yeah, but God bless a 2-year-old. That's all I could say.
Hey, I'll gladly fill my tags with
Oh,
2-year-olds.
yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
He comes running in after he gobbles his face off all morning on the roost. I'm
That's
fine
what
with
it's all
that.
about. I mean, that's why I mean, I think that would speak for most turkey hunters. That's why we
Yeah.
do it. I mean,
Yeah.
gosh.
Will likes to pick on my poor calling ability, but I get it done with the 2-year-olds. So
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I just do that because I'm projecting my poor calling ability on you.
well, I know, but I didn't know if the audience knew.
Some of the most accomplished turkey killers that have existed, folks like Wayne Bailey, for instance, who restored turkeys all over eastern North America, said he sucked at calling, and he killed hundreds of turkeys. And his mantra was, if you think like a turkey, you can kill a turkey. Right. So he just put himself in places where a turkey would naturally want to use, and he was patient as paint drying,
Mm-hmm.
and that it worked out for him. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, not
Yeah.
faulting, not casting shade on the truly talented callers, and I'm not one of them. And having spent time with some exceptional callers, I'm envious of their abilities.
Some of
But
them just blow me away. I
oh
don't
God,
understand how they make the sounds they do.
Yeah.
But, the other thing that came to mind, you were talking about the individual variation. Well, the same thing is true for the voices of hens. I mean, some hens sound absolutely terrible.
Yeah,
They
they
don't
do.
sound like a hen to me.
Yeah.
And then I realize, oh, I'm just one of those hens
it
that
gives us all hope, doesn't it?
That's right.
Yeah. She sounds terrible, and I think I sound better than she does.
Yeah.
You know what's funny is the other night I was laying in bed about to go to sleep, and I can't even remember what it was, a video somebody had sent me or something like that, and I clicked on it, and it was a hen yelping, and my wife was across the room, and she was like, "My God, who is that calling?" And I was like, "That's an actual hen." And she's like, "No, it's not." I mean, she wouldn't believe me. I mean, we went back and forth like 5 times, and finally I showed her the video. But one thing that I wanted to make sure that we got to, because we kind of skipped over it, we got excited with several questions today, but um, can you go back and talk a little bit about those first few weeks as a poult and how important it is for them to get flighted and that whole process? Because I think that was one of the things that at least I had in mind to cover. Thinking about what it takes for them to get from the egg to the gobbler phase, where we're most interested in as hunters.
Yeah, for sure. So that first couple of weeks, as that's when survival is the lowest. So these birds they're hatching. It's taking the better part of a day for the hatching sequence to progress to where the hen can leave. So she's vulnerable, the clutch is vulnerable, and then finally she convinces everybody to get away from that nest. And what we see is that first day they move several hundred yards away from that nest site to roost. That first night they're not flighted, they're stuck on the ground, they're brooding under the hen. So she's now going to places that are very different than where she's been spending the last month. She's going to these areas where she can squat down at night, have some type of cover, but also be able to escape quickly. Think areas with um, a little bit of debris on the ground, maybe a log she can hide beside, maybe open herbaceous vegetation where it's knee high and she can stand up and take her periscope and look over it and then squat back down. Areas where poults can move freely about her and not be choked up in dense vegetation. And what we've seen is they progressively they start increasing their movements almost on a daily basis as those poults are growing very rapidly. But their diet at that point is almost entirely insects, and these are insects that have to be within the first 8 to 10 inches of the ground.
Mm-hmm.
So think very succulent green vegetation with open spaces where the poults can move. The vegetation is low enough to where insects are perched on the vegetation at ground level, and excuse me, and those poults are spending most of their day scarfing up insects, with the hen being observant. And at that time, they're extremely vulnerable, and so is she, because she's having to pay attention to everything that's going on around her. We do see mortality of brood hens frequently, and that's when a lot of these poults are being lost to predators, such as that they would encounter during the day, such as hawks, owls, rat snakes, things that are capable of picking off small birds that are moving about on the ground. And that lasts for about, depending on the ability of those poults to capture sufficient numbers of insects to support their growth rates and their molting, because they're already starting to replace feathers, right? I mean, as they're
Mm-hmm.
4 or 5 days old, they typically will start getting off the ground in about 10 to 14 days, but we have seen that that does differ by brood. One common thing we start seeing broods do when they are starting to get closer to that 2-week mark, the hen will often roost or loaf. In other words, they'll take a break during the day and they'll hang out at a spot. A lot of times when we go to those spots, there's woody debris there. There's a treetop. There's something. Imagine a skidder pushed over some saplings when they were doing a thinning operation. There's some downed hardwoods that are leaning, and there's a
Mm-hmm.
root ball there. Something that's giving those poults the opportunity to get off the ground where they can chill out, if you will, and not she's not constantly having to be vigilant with them around her on the ground. And historically, we thought that once they got to that point, they were pretty much safe, that once they started roosting off the ground. But we're seeing that that's not a foolproof case. We're continuing to lose poults when we monitor broods after that 2-week mark, but it certainly decreases
Mm-hmm.
dramatically
Yeah.
from say day 5 or 6 till day 20.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
kind of what they go through, and so it just speaks volumes to me about it. We're losing a lot of our poults during, well, first of all, what we've discussed is what it takes to just produce one poult,
Right.
but then once we produce one, we're losing most of them that first few weeks. And it just speaks to the importance of these disturbed, open vegetative communities with succulent green vegetation, and the ability for the hen to see and for the poults to move. And y'all have talked a lot about this on this podcast, is what it takes to create that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that we don't understand how to do it. It's that I've seen in my career just a dramatic decline in the availability of
Yeah.
those habitat types.
Yeah. And I mean, it's really kind of eye-opening for me to think about the difference between, a poult that gets flighted at 10 days versus 14 days. Well, 4 days may not seem like that much, but if you think about it, like, if you're just this defenseless little protein packet, running around on the ground, and basically anything and everything that you run into could potentially kill you, then 4 more days of that, I mean, that sounds like a much taller order, when you look at it from that perspective versus us just sitting back on the couch thinking about, what does 10 versus 14 days matter?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, if you
I
think
mean,
about when it's a 2-week period we're trying to get through,
Right.
now we're talking about 25% or more of the time, an increase in time.
yeah,
It's,
and think about it from the standpoint of, that time of year, it gets dark, let's just say 8 o'clock, or well, I'll pick a number. Let's say 7:30 or 8 o'clock. They're hunkered down and they're not leaving that roost site until daylight the next morning. That's a lot of time to sit stationary dealing with every predator that's crawling, walking, or slithering on the ground at night. Plus, you're dealing with aerial predators like owls that are capable of taking you at night versus a few days earlier getting in a tree where you can get up against the base of a trunk, where you can get under the canopy of leaves, where you can move around and your scent's not on the ground anymore, the hen scent's not on the ground. I mean, yeah, 4 days, to me is huge. And like Marcus, to your point, you're right. I mean, if you talk about the time frame we're talking proportionately, we're talking about a quarter of
mhm.
difference, which to me is huge.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Mike, what I think we kind of started out this way. I may have said something along these lines, but I know that you're getting tons of questions because of the heightened enthusiasm for turkeys right now, just like we are. Are there? Well, maybe I'll put it a different way. We keep getting several lines of questions, and sometimes it's easier for us to address the masses, so to speak, on here rather than trying to do it through an Instagram post or whatever. Are there questions that are coming up for you frequently right now that you would like to address? Like we can just give you an opportunity to address anything you want to.
To be honest with you, I I get so many questions that are all over the board right this time of year. It's
Yeah.
it's I get a lot of questions, not like right now, like when we're taping this, but once the seasons really get going in the South, I start getting tons and tons of questions about plumage abnormalities,
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
birds that people are shooting that have, some sign of a sickness.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Um,
we're getting that a
tra-
lot.
yeah, that's what I start getting a lot of. Of course, as soon as the season kicks off, outside of just Texas and Florida now, in Mississippi, when it really gets in earnest, say, first couple weeks of April, you start seeing a lot of social media posts, and reels about kills, and I'll get a lot of questions about, you know, the techniques we use,
Mm-hmm.
opinions about decoys or not, blinds or not, this or not. I get a lot of questions about that,
Yeah,
and
we're getting that too.
Yeah.
yeah, and that's just, it goes with the territory. I mean, we're passionate about what we're doing, and I think turkey hunters all want the same thing. We just have different ways of looking at it, and that stuff is unavoidable. I hate to see it, honestly. I hate to see people, criticize others for what they're doing, but it's, those are the types of questions that I'll start
Mm-hmm.
getting, like you are.
Yeah.
Um and like y'all know this. I mean, there's a lot of questions you just don't have an answer to. I
Mm-hmm.
mean,
Absolutely.
we just don't have the science to support.
Yeah.
We can speculate and we can have our conjectures and all, but at the end of the day, there's just some things we don't have a grasp on right now, and
Mm-hmm.
those are the tough questions to answer.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, we've definitely been getting an assortment of questions, but we just had, I guess it was yesterday from when we were recording, we just had a disease episode because we're getting, constant questions related
Hmm.
to diseases, and finally had somebody that actually works on disease come on the show to talk about it. So yeah, definitely hear what you're saying. And sometimes I get things and I just don't know what to say. But sometimes it's something like, what is a forb? I can hammer that one.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
yeah. The whole disease issue is interesting to me because there's been a lot of work done on diseases as far as prevalence goes, and you guys know this, like what percentage of birds have something, but there hasn't been a lot of work on, well, what does that mean?
Yeah.
And I know there's, and I have some, and I know others do as well. What is a bird with a virus? Does it behave differently? Does it have different reproduction? And I have a student actually that's one of her thesis chapters that will be done this spring. It better be done this spring. If she listens to this podcast, Paige, you better finish it up. Her thesis is actually teasing some of that out, trying to figure out, does having these viruses matter? Does it influence reproduction or behavior? Do they move differently? As y'all know, I mean, there has been a little bit of work showing that maybe there are some consequences to some of these viruses, but we just don't know. And it does appear that some of these viruses are very prevalent in our turkey populations, and that's interesting. So yeah, I get those questions too, particularly once people start killing birds and they get to the bird and they see the bird has lesions on its head or has something going on or they open the bird up and they see lesions on the liver or spleen or something like that, and that's when they get concerned and they start reaching out on social media.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you that it feels like we're at a much earlier stage of discovery on the turkey, the disease science or the disease ecology at this point in time.
Well, even talking to someone who studies diseases and to have things that you don't even know where it came from or how it's transmitted,
Right.
like that is kind of remarkable to me.
Yeah.
And and admittedly, I've never been a disease guy, and that's a fault because I've kind of my research until very recently didn't include disease work, and I that's partially a failure on my part because some of these diseases like LPDV, which I'm sure you've talked about, it's been around for a while. We've known it's been in our populations, and really until recently there wasn't much work that focused on it. And
Yeah.
despite the fact that we were seeing pretty high prevalence rates,
Right.
and and now we're seeing, I mean, we have, I'm not going to name this population because it's not entirely my data set, but we do have populations that the prevalence seems to be 70+%, meaning that just about most, you flip a coin, 3 out of 4 have the virus, and that to me is really interesting. And we
When
just
we were
need to know
talking
what.
to Rick Gerhold,
Okay, yeah,
he threw out some numbers upwards of up. I think he even said up to 80 in some cases. Then he will.
Yeah, it's insanely high. I mean,
yeah,
it makes me wonder: is this going to be one of those things like like a lot of the hemorrhagic disease strains in deer? Do we find out that most southeastern deer have been exposed to it, but overall we don't think it's like of huge consequence to vital rates most years?
hmm
Um, like, is it going to be like that with turkeys and LPDV, or are we seeing like it makes them more susceptible to other causes of mortality, or more susceptible to other types of disease? Who knows? So
yeah, and I'm really curious to see whether we'll find any. Yeah, so the work my student's doing, she's taking two approaches. She's looking at across all the populations we're studying, do they behave any differently? And as we talked about earlier, our behavioral metrics are coarse in some ways, movements and how much space they use and that type of thing. But she's also going to look at it from a reproductive standpoint. Are birds with the virus less likely to initiate nest? Are they less likely to succeed? Or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if we, I think whatever we find will be equally interesting because if it doesn't seem to, influence these metrics, that's to me is interesting. And to your point, Will, maybe, maybe the bird has been dealing with it for quite some time and we just didn't know it, and it's been there and they just deal with it, you
yeah,
know. Um, to have prevalence as high as what Rick noted and what we've seen in some of our populations is pretty striking. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
if you, for instance, were to see that avian pox virus was that prevalent in a population, you would go, whoa,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
that type of thing. So I think there's a lot of complexity there with this particular virus that's, to me, is pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm. It's exciting times.
We'll see. And then, the other thing is, what do you do about it? If you do see that the virus is being impactful to populations, what's your management reaction?
Right.
I mean, and I've been asked this, and the answer is, well, boy, that's a tough one. What do you say?
Yeah.
I mean, what are you going to do about a virus that 75% of the population has?
Right.
Deal with it.
Account for it in harvest management. I mean, what else?
Maybe if you
What
see
else
that
can
it
you do?
matters.
Yeah.
If you see that it matters. If it doesn't matter to demographics, and then just to me, I mean, and I don't mean to be dismissive, but in some ways, if we end up seeing that it's not impactful to the metrics that we know drive our populations, then maybe it's noise. Maybe it's just something the bird's been dealing with.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to know potentially how it spread and see if there's anything we can do to try to cut down on that, but we haven't even made
there
that.
has been some work done. Squidus the folks here at UGA they've done some captive work, and this is not my work, although I'm part of it, so I'll just kind of paraphrase, but
Is this what they just recently published, Mike, that you're going into?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
Yep.
And they've got some other stuff. They've got some other stuff ongoing too, that basically there are multiple ways it could be transmitted, but a very likely source is subcutaneous, through skin, which would basically biting insects.
Mm-hmm.
And the logical thought there would be mosquitoes.
Mm-hmm.
And geez, if mosquitoes are spreading or spreading the virus, then that would jive with the fact that a lot of birds have it, because I mean, who hasn't sat there and watched mosquitoes buzz around the head of a bird as they're filtering past you, and they're constant, their head flicking, and they deal with it around their heads. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we appreciate your time, Mike. This has been a great conversation.
Yeah,
not
really
a problem,
enjoyed it.
man. I enjoyed it. It's good talking to you guys, and anytime I'm more than happy to come on and chit chat about turkeys. It's the time of year.
It is indeed.
Yeah,
it's about
for
to
sure.
get crazy.
Hopefully everybody out there is getting a chance to go look at some.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna get after some in the morning, so we're gonna see what happens.
Oh, I'm jealous. My season's still a few weeks away. I've got some stuff I really can't walk away from for the next couple of weeks, but early April it will get busy, and it's the time of year you look forward to.
Oh
Absolutely.
yeah, I'm itching.
Yeah, me too. And I know they're gobbling here, and I'm intentionally not gone and scouted the place I can hunt when the season opens yet, because I know mentally it's over if I do, because I know they're roaring. I know they're screaming their heads off. People are telling me they are. It's beautiful, crystal clear, sunny day, light winds here. And I'm thinking, oh man, I bet they were ripping it this morning.
Mm-hmm.
I've been looking at the weather, trying to figure out, okay, are we gonna hit this right in the morning? It's looking good. Good.
Just sitting there,
fingers crossed.
Just sitting there holding your breath, waiting on that first gobble of the season.
Well, now I'm afraid to call at them. Thanks, Will. So I'm just going to get where they like to go.
There you go. Pull Wayne's stunt. Just think like a turkey, man. Yeah. Be where they want to be.
There you go. All right. Well, I know you got a lot of stuff going on, Mike. Thank you for taking some time to meet with us, and appreciate everybody out there for listening. We really appreciate all the support.
Yep. Sure thing.
Thank you. Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.